For years, Michelle Obama was seen as the emotional anchor of one of the most watched families in the world. To many, she represented composure, discipline, and a kind of steady strength that never seemed to break. But behind that carefully maintained image was a reality far more complex than what appeared in public. Life inside the spotlight rarely allows space for vulnerability, and in the case of the Obama family, that pressure extended far beyond politics. It shaped their home, their parenting, and most importantly, the childhood of their daughters in ways that few people truly understood at the time. When Barack Obama became president, the moment was celebrated globally as historic and transformative. But inside the family, it marked the beginning of a completely different kind of life. For Michelle, the excitement was quickly followed by a realization that was far more personal than political. Her daughters, still very young, would now grow up under constant observation. Their lives would no longer belong fully to them. Every action, every mistake, and every ordinary moment would exist under a microscope that rarely turns away. Malia and Sasha were just children when they entered the White House. At an age when most kids are discovering independence, they were learning restriction. Their routines changed overnight. Security replaced spontaneity. Even the simplest activities required planning and approval. Something as normal as visiting a friend or stepping outside came with layers of supervision. It wasn't just about safety, it was about control over an environment where anything could quickly become public. Michelle has spoken about how deliberate she and Barack were in trying to protect their daughters from becoming symbols rather than individuals. They made a conscious effort to separate their children from the political world as much as possible. The girls were not pushed into public appearances unnecessarily. They were not expected to represent an image or perform a role. Instead, their parents tried to preserve a version of normal life, even within the constraints of an extraordinary environment. Still, no amount of planning could fully shield them. Growing up in the White House meant living in a space where privacy was limited and expectations were constant. The girls learned early how to carry themselves in front of strangers. They understood that attention wasn't always friendly, and that their reactions could be interpreted in ways they couldn't control. Over time, this awareness became part of who they were, shaping how they interacted with the world around them. Michelle later described parenting during those years as less about privilege and more about careful management. Every decision carried weight, every choice felt amplified. There was always a sense that something could go wrong, not just in a personal way but publicly. That kind of pressure doesn't disappear at the end of the day. It follows you home, into conversations, into parenting decisions, and into the quiet moments where doubt can grow. Despite all of this, Michelle remained committed to giving her daughters experiences that felt meaningful rather than symbolic. There were moments when she reconsidered how much they were being shielded. One such moment came when she realized her daughters had never attended a state dinner. It made her pause. She wondered if, in trying to protect them, she had also kept them too far removed from history that they were living through. So she made an exception. She allowed them to attend one state dinner not as public figures but as young girls experiencing something unique. It wasn't about politics or presentation. It was about memory, about giving them a moment they could look back on and understand where they had been. Even then, the decision reflected the balance she constantly tried to maintain between protection and exposure. Over time, the emotional impact of those years began to show in quieter ways, not through rebellion or resentment but through subtle shifts in how the girls viewed their own lives. When they later spoke publicly, their reflections carried a sense of relief rather than complaint. They talked about what it felt like to step out of constant visibility, to finally exist without being observed at every moment. That sense of relief revealed something important. Growing up in such an environment may look extraordinary from the outside, but it comes with a kind of pressure that is difficult to explain. It's not just about rules or restrictions. It's about living with the awareness that you are always being watched, always being interpreted, and rarely being understood fully. For Michelle, those years also carried a different kind of weight. She wasn't just navigating life as First Lady. She was raising two young black girls in a world that often judged them before knowing them. The pressure to get everything right felt constant. Any mistake could be magnified, any misstep could become a narrative. That awareness influenced how she approached motherhood in ways that were both protective and exhausting. As the years passed, the family developed ways to cope with this reality. They leaned on routine, on humor, and on each other. Inside the walls of their home, they tried to create a space that felt separate from the outside world, a place where the girls could relax, speak freely, and be themselves without performance. But even that space was never completely untouched by the reality outside. The bond between Malia and Sasha became especially important during this time. Growing up in such a unique environment meant that very few people could truly understand what they were experiencing. But they understood each other. They shared the same routines, the same restrictions, and the same unspoken awareness of what their lives required from them. That shared experience created a closeness that went beyond typical sibling relationships. It became a form of support, a way to process everything that was happening around them. While their parents focused on protecting them, they quietly built their own system of understanding within each other. When the Obama presidency came to an end, the transition back to private life was not as simple as it might seem. For years, their movements had been controlled, their environment structured. Suddenly, they were faced with a level of freedom that felt unfamiliar. Even small things like answering a doorbell or making spontaneous plans required adjustment. Michelle has spoken about how surreal that shift felt. Freedom came with its own kind of disorientation. After years of living in a highly managed environment, normal life didn't immediately feel normal. It took time for the family to rediscover what everyday life looked like without layers of security and planning. For the daughters, this transition marked the beginning of something new. It gave them space to define themselves outside of the roles they had been placed in. For the first time in years, they could explore identity without constant observation. That shift would later influence the choices they made as young adults. Looking back, those 8 years in the White House were not just a chapter of political history. They were a period of personal growth, challenge, and adaptation for the entire family. What the public saw was only part of the story. Behind it was a quieter reality shaped by careful decisions, emotional pressure, and a constant effort to maintain balance. The story of the Obama family during those years is not one of perfection. It's one of navigation, of learning how to live under extraordinary circumstances while trying to preserve something ordinary at the same time. And in many ways, that balance is what defined their experience more than anything else. As the distance from the White House grew, something else began to surface within the Obama family story, something quieter but more revealing. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about identity. For Malia Obama, stepping into adulthood did not feel like a continuation of a legacy. It felt like stepping out of one. After years of being defined by roles she never chose, she reached a point where she needed to decide who she was without the weight of a name that carried global recognition. There was no public announcement marking this shift, no statement designed to attract attention. Instead, the change appeared in a place most people wouldn't expect to look: the credits of her work. When Malia entered the film industry and contributed to her first major project, she chose to be listed simply as Malia Ann. To many, it seemed like a small detail, but in reality, it carried a deeply intentional message. This wasn't an act of rejection. It wasn't about distancing herself from her parents in a personal sense. It was about creating space. A space where her work could stand on its own before her background entered the conversation. For someone who had lived most of her life being introduced before she even spoke, this decision represented something rare, a chance to be experienced without assumption. When Michelle Obama later spoke about this choice, there was no confusion in her response. She understood it immediately. She acknowledged that removing the last name wouldn't erase who Malia was. People would still recognize her. The connection would still exist, but that wasn't the point. The point was intention. It was about allowing her daughter to attempt something on her own terms, even if the world didn't fully cooperate. Barack Obama shared a similar understanding, though his reaction carried a quiet realization. When he asked Malia about the decision, her answer was simple but revealing. She didn't want people to approach her work already decided. She wanted them to watch, to feel, and to interpret before attaching her identity to it. It was a request for fairness in a world where fairness is rarely offered without conditions. What makes this moment powerful is not just the decision itself, but what led to it. Malia had spent years watching how public perception works. She had seen how quickly praise could turn into skepticism, how success could be attributed to access rather than effort, how easily her accomplishments could be reduced to something inherited rather than earned. Over time, that awareness shaped how she approached her future. This sensitivity wasn't rooted in insecurity. It came from clarity. She understood that her starting point would never be neutral. And instead of resisting that reality openly, she chose a quieter path. She didn't argue against it, she worked around it. By removing her last name, even symbolically, she created a moment, however small, where her work could be encountered without immediate bias. Michelle later reflected on how both of her daughters had developed a similar awareness over time. They were not trying to escape their background. They were trying to avoid being confined by it. From a young age, they had seen how narratives are built around people in the public eye. They understood that once a story is created about you, it becomes difficult to step outside of it. For Malia, this meant approaching her career with patience rather than urgency. She didn't rush into directing with a sense of entitlement. She started at the bottom, taking internships, observing, learning the structure of an industry that does not easily open its doors, even to those with recognizable names. She chose the long path, the one that builds credibility quietly instead of demanding it loudly. There is something deeply human in that choice. In a world that often rewards visibility, she leaned toward invisibility. She worked behind the scenes. She focused on storytelling rather than self-presentation, and in doing so she began to build an identity that existed outside of expectation, even if it was still connected to it. This journey also reflects a deeper emotional layer that often goes unnoticed. Growing up under constant attention does not just shape behavior, it shapes self-perception. When your identity has been defined publicly for most of your life, there comes a moment where you have to ask yourself who you are without that definition. That question doesn't come with an easy answer. For Malia, the answer wasn't found in rejection but in adjustment. She didn't need to erase her past. She needed to create distance from it. Enough distance to hear her own voice clearly. Enough distance to make choices that felt personal rather than expected. And that process, while quiet, required a level of self-awareness that doesn't come easily. At the same time, this evolution was happening alongside a shared understanding within the family. Michelle and Barack were not trying to pull their daughters toward a specific path. In fact, they were doing the opposite. They were encouraging independence. They were supporting decisions that created separation rather than continuation. Barack Obama once described politics in a way that revealed more than he likely intended. He didn't present it as an honor or a calling. He described it as something consuming, something that takes more than it gives. And because of that, he made it clear that he did not want his daughters to follow that path, not because they couldn't, but because he understood the cost too well. Michelle's perspective echoed this in a quieter, more personal way. She spoke about the years of pressure, the constant need to maintain composure, the feeling that every action carried weight beyond its intention. She didn't want that for her daughters, not because it was unbearable but because it was limiting in ways that are difficult to see from the outside. This mutual understanding created an environment where Malia and Sasha were free to define themselves without expectation. They were not being prepared for leadership roles in the traditional sense. They were being prepared for autonomy, for decision-making that came from within rather than from legacy. And yet, even as they moved forward, the emotional residue of their upbringing remained, not as a burden but as a presence. It influenced how they saw the world, how they approached relationships, and how they understood attention. It taught them caution, it taught them awareness, and perhaps most importantly, it taught them the value of privacy. In many ways, Malia's decision to step into the film world quietly was not just about career, it was about control. Control over how she is introduced, control over how she is perceived, control over what parts of her life are shared and what parts remain her own. After years of living without that control, even small decisions carried significant meaning. There is also a certain vulnerability in choosing this path. When you step away from an identity that guarantees recognition, you also step into uncertainty. You allow yourself to be judged without the protection of familiarity. You risk failure in a way that feels more personal because it cannot be explained away by expectation. But that is also where growth happens. And for Malia, that growth appears to be intentional. It is not driven by the need to prove something to the public. It is driven by the need to understand herself outside of a narrative that was written before she had a chance to contribute to it. Looking at this shift from the outside, it's easy to focus on the symbolism of a name change. But the deeper story lies in what that change represents. It represents a transition from being seen to being understood, from being recognized to being evaluated, from being part of a legacy to becoming an individual within it. And in that transition, there is something that many people can relate to even without the scale of public attention. The desire to be known for who you are rather than what people assume about you. The need to create space between your past and your future. The effort it takes to build something that feels entirely your own. For the Obama family, this chapter is not about departure. It's about evolution. It's about what happens after the spotlight shifts. It's about how individuals rebuild themselves when the world stops watching as closely as it once did. And in Malia's case, it's about choosing a path that allows her to finally speak in her own voice, even if that voice is heard quietly at first. There are moments in every family's story that never reach the public stage. They are not recorded in speeches, they are not captured in photographs, and they rarely fit into the narratives people expect to hear. For the Obama family, one of those moments came long before the White House, long before global recognition, at a time when their lives were still private and uncertain in very different ways. It was a moment that had nothing to do with politics, but everything to do with fear. Sasha Obama was still a baby when something suddenly felt wrong. What began as an ordinary day quickly turned into something unrecognizable. Her cries were not the usual kind. They carried urgency, a kind of distress that instinctively signals danger to a parent. Michelle has described how quickly that shift happened, how the normal rhythm of the day disappeared and was replaced by confusion and rising panic. When doctors advised immediate medical attention, the situation became real in a way that no parent is ever prepared for. At the hospital, tests were conducted quickly, and the diagnosis came with a weight that is difficult to put into words. Sasha had meningitis, a condition that can escalate rapidly and in severe cases become life-threatening. In that moment, everything else in their lives lost significance. Michelle has spoken about how titles, ambitions, and plans all disappeared in that space. There was no future to think about, no image to maintain. There was only the present moment filled with uncertainty and fear. Watching her child undergo medical procedures, including a spinal tap, was something that stayed with her long after the immediate danger had passed. Barack Obama later reflected on that time as one of the hardest experiences of his life. Not because of the public pressure he would later face, but because of the helplessness he felt as a father. There are situations where effort, intelligence, and determination do not offer control. This was one of them. All he could do was wait, hope, and trust the people trying to save his daughter. Fortunately, Sasha recovered. The doctors acted quickly and the treatment worked, but recovery does not erase memory. The emotional imprint of that experience remained. It changed how Michelle and Barack understood vulnerability. It reshaped their sense of control and reinforced a truth that would follow them into every stage of life that came afterward. That moment helps explain something deeper about how they later approached parenting in the White House. Their caution was not only about public image or political consequence, it was rooted in something far more personal. They had already experienced how fragile life can be. They understood that protection is not just about safety, it is about preserving what matters most in ways that are not always visible. But even before Sasha's illness, there was another experience that shaped Michelle in a quieter, more internal way. Before becoming a mother, she had gone through a miscarriage. At the time, it was something she carried largely on her own. There was confusion, a sense of loss, and a feeling of personal responsibility that many women experience in silence. Michelle later shared that she initially believed she had done something wrong, that the loss was somehow connected to her actions or choices. It took time and perspective to understand that this experience was not uncommon, even though it is rarely discussed openly. That realization did not remove the pain, but it changed how she understood it. Eventually, she and Barack turned to IVF to conceive their daughters. It was not an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. It also introduced another layer of awareness about timing, biology, and the complexity of balancing personal and professional life. These were not conversations happening in public at the time, but they became part of the foundation that shaped their family. These experiences, loss, fear, recovery, are not typically associated with public figures in the way people perceive them, but they are often the moments that define how individuals move through the world. For Michelle, they deepened her sense of empathy. They influenced how she spoke about motherhood and how she chose to share her story with others later on. When she eventually opened up about these parts of her life, it was not for attention. It was to create connection, to make space for conversations that are often avoided, to remind people that behind every composed image there are experiences that are far more complex than they appear. As the Obama family moved beyond the White House years, another transition began, one that was less visible but equally significant. It was the shift from a life defined by structure and security to one defined by independence and choice. For Michelle, this meant rediscovering what everyday life felt like without constant oversight. She has described simple moments that suddenly felt unfamiliar: driving without coordination, answering a door without assistance, hearing a doorbell and realizing that no one else was there to respond. These are small details, but they represent a much larger shift, a return to a kind of autonomy that had been absent for years. For Malia and Sasha, this transition also brought a different kind of adjustment. After growing up in an environment where movement was restricted and decisions were managed, freedom required learning. It was not just about doing what they wanted. It was about understanding how to make choices independently, without the framework they had always known. One of the most telling aspects of this new phase was the relationship between the two sisters. While their lives began to move in different directions, their connection remained strong. They chose to stay close, even as they built separate identities. At one point, they even decided to live together not out of necessity but out of comfort and familiarity. Michelle has spoken about how she found out about this decision in a way that surprised her. It wasn't through a formal conversation but through something more casual, and instead of reacting with concern, she felt reassured. The fact that her daughters still chose each other meant that the bond they had built over the years had endured. Their shared living space was not extravagant. It was not designed to reflect status or expectation. It was simple, functional, and personal. Michelle once mentioned visiting them and noticing the small details of their daily life, even joking about how they were still figuring out things like making a proper drink. These moments, while lighthearted, revealed something deeper. They showed that despite everything they had experienced, Malia and Sasha were building lives that felt grounded. They were not trying to live up to an image, they were not performing adulthood. They were learning it, step by step, in a way that felt real rather than constructed. In rare public moments, particularly during conversations surrounding Michelle's book tour and documentary, the daughters spoke about their experiences with a kind of honesty that stood out. They did not focus on difficulty alone. They acknowledged the effort their parents had made. They recognized the stability that had been maintained, even under pressure. Malia in particular expressed something that captured the essence of their experience. She spoke about those 8 years not as a burden but as something that had meaning, not because of the political significance but because of what their family had managed to preserve within it. A sense of love, consistency, and care that remained intact despite everything happening around them. This perspective adds a final layer to the story. It shifts the narrative away from extremes, away from seeing their lives as either entirely privileged or entirely difficult. Instead, it presents something more balanced, a reality where both can exist at the same time, where opportunity and pressure are intertwined. The story of the Obama family, when viewed through this lens, becomes less about status and more about adaptation. It becomes a reflection of how individuals navigate circumstances they did not choose and how they find ways to remain grounded within them. In the end, what their daughters revealed was not something dramatic or scandalous. It was something quieter but more meaningful. They showed that even in the most visible lives, there are unseen struggles, deliberate choices, and emotional realities that rarely make it into the public narrative. And perhaps that is what makes their story resonate, not the history they lived through, but the way they lived within it.